Well, hello. It's time for reading. Hang on a second. I have to adjust some things. I'm moving my mic a lot, so I apologize for weird noises. I'm so sorry. I'm sure that sounds terrible. Okay. Hopefully that's good. Whoops. Hello. I'm a pro. Oh, how's it going this evening? Happy Labor Day to anybody in the States who is celebrating that. And happy Monday evening or whatever day or time it is for whoever's watching this at whatever point you're watching this in the course of time. Welcome to part 2 of Whispers in the Fog, which is Nancy Drew number 153 and is the book that Danger on Deception Island, the 9th Nancy Drew game, is based off of. So I read the first third last week, and let me do a little mathy math because I'm unprepared. I had read 49 pages, so I should... Hi, Semi. Thank you so much for the host. How are you? It's good to see you. I should read another 50 pages or so. Let me look and see. I'll probably read 6, 7... Oh, I'm getting scarred. Hopefully you guys can still hear the music. Yes, long time no see. I hope you're doing well. Hi, Riddy. Thank you for the host. I think I'll read chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. That's 6 chapters. Woo! But I think I'm going to read 6 chapters tonight. Yeah, that's okay. I'll definitely read 5, maybe 6 chapters. Whoop. All right, so, yeah. There's no more reason to delay. Let us just... Yes, obviously we're gonna just dance. Okay. So, we are picking up at chapter 6. A break in the action. A minute passed, and then another. Nancy waited breathlessly in her hiding place in the cypress grove. Finally, she took a breath, and the aching in her lungs subsided. Straining to pick up any sound from her stalker, she heard only voices in the distance. Bess, George, and Ned were calling her from the bluff top. They sounded so far away, and she was a little disoriented from all her weaving in and out of the trees. If I call back to them, will they hear me? She wondered. I'm sure the stalker will. Can Ned and the others get here before the stranger does? She heard Ned and George repeat their call. The footsteps inside the Cypress Cathedral started up again. This time they weren't the nearly silent ones of someone sneaking up on her as she had heard before. They were heavy footfalls, pounding toward her hiding place. Nancy saw someone streak by her in a dark blur. The person ran so fast she couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. The footsteps grew fainter and fainter. Then, after a few minutes, she heard a motor start up. Cautiously, she emerged from her hiding place. There was no one in sight. She raced in the direction the person had run and came to an opening in the east side of the Cypress Cathedral. In the distance, she saw the dust of a vehicle heading down the road. Nancy! Nancy, where are you? Ned's voice boomed from inside the cypress grove. Stop playing games! Get out here! I'm here, Ned, she called. What happened? George asked as she, Bess, and Ned met Nancy under the arches of the trees. Why didn't you answer when we called earlier? Quickly, Nancy told the others what had happened. The girls had seen nothing from their vantage point at the base of the bluff down on the beach. "I didn't see anyone either," Ned said, "and I was on the trail the whole time, from the trees to the bikes and back again." "Whoever it was could have come through the same way he or she exited," George said. "And just hidden here waiting for us to come in?" Bess concluded. "Someone must have followed us out here." "But aren't we jumping to conclusions again?" George asked. "Every time something weird happens, we assume it's a stalker or a threat. We don't really know that someone followed us here," she added. "Right, Nancy? It could have just been someone out for a sunset stroll on the bluffs or through the cypress grove. Maybe he or she was afraid of running into you in this dark place. What we see as menacing could have been fear or suspicion." Nancy shook her head slowly, her brow pleated into a frown. Actually, each one of these incidents by itself could be explained or excused as coincidence or accident or something else completely innocent. But when you add them up, it's just too much. "Let's look around here. Maybe the shadow dropped a clue to help us out." Armed with Nancy's and George's penlights, the four searched the Cypress Cathedral, but they found nothing. "Let's get out of here," Bess said. "It's just about dark, and even with our lights, it's going to be hard to see." "Good idea," George agreed. "We need to get some rest before we climb into the kayak cockpits tomorrow." They picked up their bikes and started back. When they reached Seabreak, Nancy noticed a lot of cars parked on the bluff above the harbor. One of them was the rusty red Mustang. "Looks like something's going on at the diner," Nancy said. "Let's stop for a soda." Nancy and her friends locked their bikes in the bike rack and went into the diner. A woman was speaking at the front of the room. She looked about 45 years old and had straight dark hair and glasses with gold wire frames. "My name is Joan Kim," the woman announced as Nancy and the others walked across the room. "I own a small fleet of fishing boats up the coast. I've been told you are having some problems with a whale-watching business down here." She paced back and forth. "I want you to know that we went through the same threat to our business that you are facing now," Joan Kim continued. "We managed to get the whale-watching stopped and our waters kept free for fishing." Nancy led Bess, George, and Ned to a booth just inside the door. No one spoke to them, but she recognized several of the fishermen and the waitress she'd interviewed the night before. She scanned the room but did not see Holt Scotto. "I'm sure most of you have heard of Andy Jason," Miss Kim said, after Nancy and her friends were seated. Bess poked Nancy's arm at the mention of Jason's name. "He tried to bring whale-watching boats into my area," Miss Kim continued. The woman smiled at the crowd. "But he didn't succeed." "How'd you stop it?" someone asked from a stool at the counter. "We banded together, that's how," Miss Kim said. "We got all the fishermen together and launched a campaign to keep Andy Jason and all the whale-watching businesses out of our territory." "What kind of a campaign are you talking about?" a woman asked from a table close to where Kim was standing. "Nothing fatal," Miss Kim added with a laugh, "and nothing strictly illegal. But there are things you can do to intimidate outsiders and discourage them from staying." As Joan Kim answered the question, the waitress came to Nancy's booth and quietly took their orders for sodas. Nancy watched while the waitress went back behind the counter. Soon she saw the waitress and the cook whispering to each other. The waitress's red ponytail bobbed as she nodded. Then the cook looked toward Nancy's booth. Within minutes, the cook and the waitress returned. The cook was not a large man, but his eyes were a piercing steel gray. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave," the cook said to Nancy. The waitress looked a little frightened as she stood next to the booth. "Excuse me?" Nancy said. It was a question, not a statement. "I want you out of here," the cook said. "Now." He turned to the waitress. "Clear this table," he ordered. With an apologetic half-smile, the waitress began taking water glasses and napkins away from Nancy, Bess, George, and Ned. "Wait a minute," Ned said. "What's going on here? We ordered sodas." "The diner's closed," the owner said, "especially to you four. Now I want you to get up and leave." "But the sign says you're open," Nancy said without moving. "Not to you," the cook said. "Not to friends of Katie Firestone. This is a private party." Bess, Ned, and George looked at Nancy for direction. She was suddenly aware that Joan Kim had stopped talking. "Hey, it's those outsiders that was asking questions last night," one of the fishermen yelled from across the diner. Nancy recognized him from their meeting on the pier. "They got no business being here," a woman shouted. "Get 'em out!" Several people came over to Nancy's booth as if to back up the cook. Nancy stood, saying, "We're not here to make trouble. We stopped in for sodas, and that's all." Ned, Bess, and George slid out of the booth and followed Nancy to the door. Nancy could feel the waves of anger and fear that were filling the room. She knew they had to leave. "Whew," Bess said, climbing onto Katie's red bike. "I'm glad we're out here in the fresh air, even if it is foggy. That place is really creepy." They looked back to see the cook's face glowering at them from the window of the diner. "And how about that Joan Kim?" George said. "Did you hear her say nothing fatal or strictly illegal? It gave me chills." "Who is this Joan Kim?" Ned asked. "And where is she from?" "I don't know," Nancy said, maneuvering her bike onto the road, "but I'm going to find out." There was no traffic on the 2-lane road down the coast to Katie's and the inn where Nancy, Ned, and Bess were staying. The four took turns leading, then falling back. After about 2 miles, George took the lead, followed by Ned, then Bess. Nancy was last and lost in thought. It was no coincidence that Joan Kim showed up at the Seabreak Diner, she concluded. I'm sure someone invited her there. Was it Holt Scotto? And where was he anyway? I would have thought he'd be front and center for that meeting. Nancy's thoughts were interrupted by Bess's voice from the road ahead. "I'll take the lead now," she said. Nancy watched her ride to the front as George fell back to second place. Nancy returned to her thoughts, turning the events of the last 2 days over and over in her mind. So Joan Kim outfoxed Nancy Jason, Nancy thought. That wasn't easy, I'll bet. He's pretty smooth. I wonder how she did it. Maybe I should contact Jason to talk to him about that. Bess led them up a small rise in the road. There were still no cars in either direction. The wind was chilly and the wisps of fog were getting thicker. Who invited Joan Kim to Seabreak? Nancy wondered. Was it Holt Scotto? "Whoa," Bess called, interrupting Nancy's thoughts. "Hey, there's something wrong with my bike. It's wobbling," and a nasty snap of metal cut off Bess's words. Then her cry pierced the fog. Bess's bike seemed to fly apart. Horrified, Nancy watched Bess barrel into Ned, somersaulting over his back wheel and landing with a horrible scraping skid on the side of the road. Bess landed in the dirt. She didn't move or cry out. Ned couldn't keep his balance and tumbled sideways, smashing his bike into a small fir tree. It's the end of chapter 6. Ouchie. Okay, let's see. Ooh, popcorn. Ooh, popcorn. Hey, HS. Her brow pleated. Brow pleated, brow pleated, brow pleated. Or you mean kayak cockpits? Kayak cockpits? That's hard to say just once. I will take some popcorn, thank you. Thank you for the claps. All right. All right, moving on. Chapter 7. Strike 2. Nancy skidded to a stop and ran to Bess, who lay on the ground, her arm twisted beneath her handlebars. Her right calf was scraped raw and bleeding, but she was conscious. "Bess, how do you feel?" Nancy asked. She unbuttoned Bess's jacket and then checked her pulse. "Do you feel dizzy or sick to your stomach? Did you hit your head?" "My wrist hurts," Bess answered, "but I think I'm okay otherwise." Carefully, Nancy and George lifted the handlebars off Bess's arm. The front wheel of her bike lay about 4 yards down the road. Ned struggled to his feet and shook his head and arms. "Are you okay, Ned?" Nancy called back over her shoulder. "Yeah, I'm fine," Ned said. He walked over to where Nancy kneeled, cautiously feeling Bess's wrist. "I don't think it's broken," Nancy said, "but we need to have a doctor check it out just in case. I don't like the looks of the scrape on your leg either, Bess." "What scrape?" Bess leaned up a little on one elbow and looked at her left leg. Blood trickled down from a bad scrape the size of her hand. Bits of dirt and weeds clung to her raw flesh. "Wow," Bess said. "I can't even feel that, but it looks horrible." "You're in shock," Nancy pointed out. "You hit pretty hard." "You're gonna feel that later, I'll bet," George said. "What happened?" "I don't know exactly," Bess said. "My front wheel started to shimmy, and then I hit that bump, and I don't know, it just seemed to fly apart." "We passed a payphone," George said. "I'll ride back and call Katie. She can pick Bess up and take her to a doctor or a clinic somewhere. I don't think they've got one in Seabreak." George rode off, and Nancy and Ned did what they could to make Bess comfortable. Ned eased his folded jacket under her head. Nancy carefully dabbed at Bess's wound with a tissue. "Are you sure you're okay, Ned?" Nancy asked. "You hit that tree pretty hard." "I'm okay. The bike took most of the impact. Looks like Katie has some major bike rehab work ahead of her." "Especially on the one Bess was riding," Nancy said. She and Ned gathered up the parts of Bess's bike and put them in a pile. Ned studied Bess's broken bike. "You know a lot about bikes, Ned. Can you tell me what happened?" Nancy asked. "Well, it looks like one of the cone nuts might have come loose," Ned told her. "This is a cone nut and the washer that goes with it." He opened his hand and showed her. "I found them near the bump in the road near where Bess said the bike broke apart." Ned picked up the front of the bike, which was no longer connected to the wheel. "This two-pronged metal piece that runs down from the handlebars is called the fork," he said. "It holds the wheel on. The axle runs between the two prongs of the fork and is held on by the cone nuts on both sides." He pointed to the nut and washer on the left side. "See, here are the cone nut and washer on this side. They're still intact." Then he pointed to the right side of the fork. "But this side of the axle isn't connected to the fork anymore. It pulled away, the wheel spun off, and Bess was dumped." "And the axle pulled apart because the nut came off?" Nancy repeated. "Right," Ned said. "It must have been loose." George came shooting back on her bike. "Katie's on her way. She says the nearest clinic's about 30 miles down the coast. She called their 24-hour emergency number to tell them we're coming." "That sounds like where we were this morning," Bess said, "around where Andy Jason's office is." Katie arrived just a few minutes later. Ned and Nancy helped Bess into the second seat of Katie's van where she could stretch out. Katie and George fastened the bikes that Nancy and George had ridden onto the racks on top of the van. Nancy and Ned took the seats at the back of the van, just in front of the hold where Katie had thrown the damaged bikes. George and Katie jumped into the front seat and they headed down the coast. During the ride to the clinic, Nancy and her friends told Katie about the possible stalker in the Cypress Cathedral and the confrontation in the diner. At the clinic, Bess had a wrist x-ray. Ned was also checked over and pronounced healthy. Katie and George stayed with Bess while her leg was being cleaned and bandaged. After Ned was released, Nancy got the keys to Katie's van, and then she and Ned went outside. "I want to take another look at that bike axle," Nancy said, unlocking the back of the van. Ned took out the broken bike that had thrown Bess. They both checked it over carefully in the light from the interior of the van. Finally, Ned spoke. "Do you think the cone nut could have been loosened on purpose?" He wondered, his voice hushed. "Well, it seems odd that it would just be loose," Nancy said. "Katie rehabs these bikes and keeps them in shape herself. She seems to be very thorough. I can't see her climbing on a bike without checking to make sure the cone nuts are secure and everything's in good shape. It just doesn't make sense to me." Nancy aimed her penlight at the end of the axle that had disconnected. She bent down to get a closer look. "There," she said. "Look at that." Ned bent over and squinted into the thin beam of bright light. "Whoa," he said in a whisper. "It's been cut," Nancy said quietly, running her finger around the end of the axle. "Someone cut it about halfway through," she added as she felt the smooth edge around part of the rim. Then her finger hit a sharp, jagged point. "When she hit the bump," Ned began, "it snapped the rest of the way," Nancy finished. "Well, if it isn't Miss Lowell," a familiar voice spoke from behind her. Startled, Nancy felt her shoulders jump. Then she turned to see Andy Jason walking toward her. Nancy turned back to close the van. "I'm Lenny Lowell," she whispered to Ned. Then she turned back to face the approaching Jason. "Mr. Jason," she said, extending her hand. "Andy, remember?" Jason said, giving her a firm handshake and gesturing with the other hand toward the clinic door. "What are you doing here? Not ill, I hope?" "No, my friend. Actually, my photographer, Jane. You remember her, I'm sure. She took a spill off her bike, and we brought her here for an x-ray. This is Ned Nordstrom," she added, nodding at Ned. "Nice to meet you." Jason shook Ned's hand. Ned smiled and then mumbled a greeting. "I was at the library," Jason said, pointing to a small building across the road. "We've just had a little presentation there about whales and their migrating habits. Sorry you didn't know about it. You might have enjoyed my talk." "I'm sure I would have," Nancy said, smiling. "Well, Jane's probably ready now. It was nice to see you again." She turned to go back to the clinic. "Miss Lowell?" Jason called to her. "What's this? Riding with the competition?" Nancy turned to see Jason reading the sign painted on the side of Katie's van. "Actually, Miss Firestone drove by as Jane fell and kindly offered us a ride to the clinic." Nancy was diving deeper into deception with every word. She knew she needed to get into the clinic to warn the others before they came out and blew her cover. Really? Jason said. He gave her a quizzical look, and for a moment she was sure he didn't believe her. But why wouldn't he? She asked herself. He has no reason to suspect me. It was nice to see you again, Mr. Jason, Nancy said. Now if you'll excuse us, we should go in. Yes, well, of course, Jason said. He started to back up, watching Nancy carefully. You tell that Katie Firestone that I never give up, he called out. She hasn't heard the last from me. Nancy smiled and waved. Then she and Ned raced up the clinic steps and into the building. The doctor was telling Bess that a radiologist would call about the x-ray results the next day. While they all walked to the van, Nancy and Ned told the others about their meeting with Andy Jason. As Katie backed the van out of the clinic parking lot, Nancy noticed a large luxury car parked in the shadows away from the lights. Katie pulled out onto the road. From her vantage point, at the window in the rear of the van, Nancy saw the face of the driver in the luxury car. It was Andy Jason, and he was definitely watching them. Katie, I need to stop at the sheriff's office on the way back, Nancy said. I want to show him your bike. What are you saying? Bess asked, sitting up at the start. Are you telling me that was not an accident? Nancy and Ned told the others their suspicions. When she hit that bump, the axle broke, Nancy concluded. Boy, Jen is going to be sorry she hit the sack early, Katie muttered. She missed all the excitement. No one spoke again until they reached the sheriff's office. Nancy, Ned, and Katie took the bike into the small building. Sheriff Harvey was just leaving, so they gave him a quick report and left the broken bike. The sheriff seemed very interested in Nancy and Ned's theory of the bike accident. He also told them he expected to have analysis of the fingerprints taken from Katie's vandalized boat by the next day. Nancy also mentioned the possible stalking incident in the Cypress Cathedral. When they reached the inn where Nancy, Ned, and Bess were staying, Katie and George dropped them off. I think you all need to sleep in a little tomorrow, Katie said. Why don't you come down to the house about 10? We'll have late breakfast. Nancy and Ned waved the others off and then helped Bess limp up into the inn. Upstairs, Ned went on to his room, and Nancy unlocked the door to the room she shared with Bess. Bess complained that her leg was starting to get pretty sore. She limped and hopped into the room and over to her bed. As she made her way, she dragged a small piece of folded paper halfway across the rag rug. Finally, Bess's foot left the paper behind as she climbed up on her bed. Nancy reached down to pick up the piece of paper. Clutching the note, she turned her back to Bess and unfolded the paper to find a hand-printed note. So sorry your friend got hurt, but it's your fault. This is just the beginning unless you back off and stay out of things that are none of your business. Alright, that's the end of chapter 7. Good, she was wearing a helmet. Wear your helmet, boys and girls. Stick figure violence in this is bad without a helmet. Mr. Jason, your last name is a first name. It's not his fault. And hi, Tara. I'm glad you're here for even a short bit. The sheriff seemed very interested in Nancy and Ned. He knew he'd be writing fan fiction later. You've gotten notes like that a lot? I'd be interested to find out the authors of these notes. Thank you for the claps. Being nice, internet. Okay. Chapter 8. Oh, Bess moaned. My leg really hurts. Oh yes, the doctor gave you some medicine for the pain, Nancy said, quickly slipping the note into a jeans pocket. I'll get you something to drink. Nancy took a bottle of juice from the minibar. In the bathroom decorated with blue and gold tiles, she poured the juice into a glass. I'm not going to tell Bess about the note tonight, she thought. Tomorrow's soon enough. Bess is already upset and sore, and what she really needs is a good night's sleep. Nancy took the note from her pocket and read it again. Holt Scotto knows where our room is, she thought. He was here last night. She slipped the note back into her pocket, her mind awhirl. Scotto's car was parked outside the diner earlier, she told herself, and he wasn't inside. He could have cut the axle then, but what about Andy Jason? Why was he hanging around the clinic after we talked? He was definitely watching us. Why? Proof, she mumbled as she stopped at the minibar again to get a couple of ice cubes. I need clues. Bess said wearily from her bed. What'd you say? We need a break in this case, Nancy said. Oh, don't say the word break to someone who just crashed a bicycle, Bess groaned with a lopsided smile. Right, Nancy said, grinning. Do you need anything? 10 hours of sleep, Bess said, taking her medicine and finishing her juice before falling heavily back on the bed. I'm going to run down to the reception area, Nancy said. I'll be back in a minute. Mm-hmm. Bess hummed, her eyes closed. Nancy went downstairs where she found Mrs. O'Prey, the innkeeper. Good evening, Nancy said. She took a deep breath and gave the woman a warm smile. She didn't want to alarm Mrs. O'Prey or even make her suspicious. Did anyone stop by to see Bess, Ned, or me this evening? Why, no, Mrs. O'Prey said. Were you expecting someone? Yes, actually. I didn't know whether they'd stop by or not, but we hadn't heard from them. Who were you expecting? Friends of ours from River Heights, Nancy said, a man and a woman, or maybe just one of them. They weren't sure they could both make it. We thought we'd be home sooner than we were. Well, I wasn't down here every minute, of course, but I don't believe anyone came. Thank you, Nancy said. I'm sure we'll hear from them tomorrow. She smiled again and went back upstairs. Her bed and the soft quilts were a welcome haven. Nancy awoke early Wednesday morning and went onto the tiny balcony outside her room. The air was damp and foggy. Nancy read the note again. It was in pencil, hand-printed in block capital letters. Apparently, the author knew that would make it more difficult to identify the handwriting. Someone sneaked up here and slipped this note under our door, Nancy told herself. Someone who knew our room number. She went inside. Bess was still sleeping soundly. Nancy sat at the desk in the corner of the room and dialed the sheriff's office. Hello, Sheriff Harvey, she said, keeping her voice low so she wouldn't wake Bess. Did you get that fingerprint report yet? Yes, I did, the sheriff told her. The fingerprints we lifted from Katie Firestone's boat do not match anything we have on file here. Have you heard of anyone named Joan Kim? Nancy asked. She told the sheriff about the meeting in the diner the night before. Just what I need, he grumbled. Another outsider poking around. I don't mean you, of course, Miss Drew, he said quickly. You're practically a professional from what Katie says. Well, I guess I'd better find out who Joan Kim is and what she's doing around here. Then Nancy told Sheriff Harvey about the threatening note she'd received. Seems my work's cut out for me today, isn't it? The sheriff replied. I don't like the sound of that note one bit. I'll send someone over to pick it up right away. I'll leave it at the desk with Mrs. O'Prey, Nancy told him. When she hung up, she copied the message in her notebook. Then she put the original in an envelope, sealed it, put the sheriff's name on the front, and ran it down to the large antique desk Mrs. O'Prey used for guest check-in. By the time Nancy returned to the room, Bess was up and getting dressed. How are you feeling? Nancy asked, watching Bess pull wide-legged blue cotton pants gingerly up over her scraped legs. Well, I feel like I've been hit by a sneaker wave, Bess answered, moaning. Actually, it doesn't hurt as much as I thought it would. I'm not going to be doing any kayaking today, though. I'm not sure anyone is, Nancy said, gazing out the window. It's pretty foggy out there. They finished getting ready about the time Ned rapped on their door. He helped Bess down the stairs, and Nancy drove their rental car to Katie's. Over breakfast, Nancy told the others about the note and showed them the copy she had made. Katie and George told me about your adventures out on the bluffs and at the diner, Jenna said, and I was so sorry to hear about Bess's crash. How are you doing this morning, Bess? Better, thanks, Bess said, smearing a muffin with boysenberry jam. Nancy told everyone about her conversation with Sheriff Harvey. I think he was trying to tell us something when he emphasized that he didn't have anything on file that matched the prints, Katie said. Holt Scotto got in some trouble a few months ago. There was some kind of brawl outside the diner, and he and some others were taken in by the sheriff. They were booked and spent the night in jail, I think, but they were released the next day. So he would have Scotto's prints on file, Ned concluded. Which still doesn't rule him out, George pointed out, peeling an orange. Even though his prints don't match the ones Sheriff Harvey collected, it doesn't mean he didn't do it. He could have worn gloves, for example. Did the sheriff say he was going to talk to this Scotto person about any of this? Jenna asked. Not exactly, Nancy said. He didn't like the looks of the axle on the bicycle, though, and he sent someone over right away to pick up the note. Sheriff Harvey is a good man, Katie said. I trust him to do everything he can. I don't see how anyone can track down who wrote that note, Jenna said. Not if it looked the way you said and the innkeeper didn't see who delivered it. What I can't figure out, Nancy said, her eyes narrowing as she thought, is how someone knew about Bess's accident so soon after it happened, unless of course that person was following us. Everyone was quiet for a moment, lost in their own thoughts. It's like you said, Nancy, Katie finally noted. This is a small town. I'm always amazed at how fast news and rumors spread. Katie, Jenna, and George were determined to go kayaking, so after breakfast they started packing up the gear. Jenna had brought a spare kayak but seemed reluctant to lend it. Katie had 3 spares, and since Bess would be staying on shore, Nancy, Ned, and George were all supplied. This is a great spot for sea kayaking, Katie said. It has the perfect balance of wind, waves, and tide. And it's kind of remote, so we shouldn't be bothered by anyone. Good, Bess said. I want the beach to myself. They decided to take both Katie's and Jenna's vans, and by noon, they had both vehicles packed. As they were walking to the car, the phone rang. Katie went in to answer it in case it was the sheriff with news about his investigation. As the others milled around the vans, Andy Jason's large luxury car glided into Katie's driveway. Nancy was instantly on guard, remembering the way he had watched them pulling out of the clinic parking lot the night before. Well, Jane, Andy Jason said to Bess as he climbed out of the car, I hope you're better this morning. He looked down at her wrist wrapped in an elastic bandage. Hello, Lenny, Andy said, turning to Nancy. So I find you with Katie Firestone again. Over Jason's shoulder, Nancy could see Jenna. The young woman looked surprised when she heard Andy call Nancy and Bess by undercover names. Then Nancy saw George and Ned take Jenna's arms and pull her behind the van. Nancy was sure they were filling her in. Hello, Andy, Katie said as she walked out of the house and down the driveway. How come every time I turn around you're there? I'm just here to lend a hand, Andy said in a jovial, good-natured manner. I heard your boat was trashed and I'm here to offer you one of mine to use until yours gets fixed. I appreciate it, but you wasted a trip, Katie answered. My boat is back in working order. It's interesting that you should bring up the vandalizing of Miss Firestone's boat, Nancy said, thinking fast. As a matter of fact, that's why Jane and I are here. She told us about it when she kindly gave us a ride last night, and we came back this morning to get a story about the incident for the Canyon Courier. She smiled at Nancy. How did you find out about it? Nancy asked. I'm surprised word got down the coast so fast. Were you in our area when it happened by chance? For a moment, Andy glared at Nancy, searching her expression. Then he relaxed and said with a grin, Why, we whale watchers have to stick together, right, Katie? He turned away from Nancy toward Katie. You know, if you'd just work for me, you wouldn't have these kinds of problems. What's that supposed to mean? Katie asked. I just meant that if your boat was part of my fleet, you'd get the advantage of my full security force and system behind you. Your boat wouldn't have to sit isolated on some dock where anyone could come aboard, ransack it, and tear up your motor. Andy, give it up, Katie said. I'm staying independent. You might as well accept it. Okay. I'll leave, but I'm not giving up, he said, shaking his head as he walked back to his car. You will come to work for me. He gave them all a jaunty wave and drove off. I tell you, that guy gives me the creeps, George said, as she, Ned, and Jenna emerged from behind the van. He's just too smooth. It was the clinic that called, Katie reported. Bess, your wrist is definitely not broken, but it is sprained. You need to keep it wrapped for a few days and not use it too much. Sounds like an afternoon of lazy beachcombing is an approved activity, Bess said, heading for Katie's van. Let's get going. I agree, Jenna said. It's time to forget all this detective stuff and get on with our real mission in life, sea kayaking. She checked all her gear one more time. Wait a minute, she said. Where's my helmet? Did someone take my helmet? Everyone checked the helmets in both vans. Jenna's was definitely missing. I have a couple of extras packed, Katie said. You can use one of them. Come on, we need to go. It's nearly an hour's drive, and there's a killer fog that rolls up in there. If we get stuck in it, it could be dangerous. They all piled in the vans and took off. Nancy and Ned rode with Jenna, Bess and George with Katie. Each van had 2 kayaks fastened on the top and one resting in the back. Piles of wetsuits, paddles, helmets, goggles, and other gear took up the rest of the space. They finally came to a desolate stretch of coastline that seemed to go on for miles. There were no buildings, not even a cabin or motel. This must be private property, Nancy reasoned. There's no development anywhere. Within minutes, they came to a high wire fence with simple no trespassing signs posted on it. Katie led Jenna down a road that ran along the outside of the fence to the shore. They parked the vans and began unloading their gear. Jenna changed to her wetsuit and grabbed her kayak and gear. Then she ran to the beach. Bess ambled slowly after her. This area was different from the sea lion nursery beach. There were huge rock formations farther out in the water, but few close to shore. George, I know you've kayaked and surf, Katie said, but Nancy and Ned, you need a quick course on how to maneuver in this water. Let's get the gear out and I'll give you some pointers. They changed into their wetsuits and then unpacked the vans and spread the gear out. First, everybody gets an emergency kit, Katie said, passing out the items. Keep 2 pocket flares inside your wetsuit and 2 larger parachute flares on the boat. If you're in trouble, fire a large one first. It can be seen as far as 10 or 15 miles and it goes up about 1,500 feet. The pocket flares attract someone closer and go up a third as far. Out of the corner of her eye, Nancy saw Jenna standing at the edge of the water trying on one of Katie's helmets. Bess sat at the back of the beach on a large piece of driftwood next to Jenna's kayak, sifting the sand through her fingers. As Nancy pulled on her life jacket, the sound of Bess yelling caused her to look up immediately. Bess had gotten up and was limping toward the water. Her arm was outstretched as if she were reaching for something. Nancy started toward Bess, walking at first and then breaking into a run. She could hear George, Katie, and Ned following her. Nancy kept her eyes on Bess, limping slowly toward the water. It was almost like watching a movie in slow motion. Bess seemed to be yelling again, but Nancy couldn't hear her over the low roar of the surf. As Nancy sprinted across the beach, she looked in the direction Bess was reaching. In horror, she saw what Bess was yelling about. A huge wave was roaring toward the shore. Unaware, Jenna, her back to the ocean, was adjusting the helmet around her ears. Nancy ran faster, but she was too late. No one could reach Jenna in time. Helpless, Nancy watched the wave fold over the beach and crash. When the foam and water retreated, Jenna was gone. It's the end of chapter 8. I'm trying to fix this. Whoop! That's better. My shirt was acting goofy. Okay. What you drinking? It is a... Come on, focus. Come on, camera. It's a cherry lime LaCroix. Okay. Hello, Hammer. Nothing matched the prince or the prince of mischief. I'm being dumb, but I hear it's Prince now. He can tempt her with a sandwich, pretty sure. I'm so hungry. Not the helmet. Or go clamming instead. Clamming. Clamming, clamming, clamming. I'm singing that, obviously, to the song. It's not even from this game. I can't be trusted with 2 flares. Can you be trusted with 1 flare? So yeah, Jenna in this game, or in the book, Jenna is a friend of Katie's. In the book, they are definitely more like rivals, I guess. Okay. I can be half trusted with 1 flare. But, so you can be trusted fully with no flares. Is that what you're saying to me? Maybe. Ha! Ha! Okay. I think I might do... How many have I read? I don't even know. I said I might read 6. I've read 3. Maybe I'll only read 2 more. I don't know. We've only been live for like 42 minutes, so... If someone else has a flare, then I'm gonna get it. All right. Okay, moving on. Chapter 9, From Sea to Sea. And it's like this. From sea to sea. Nancy, George, Ned, and Katie went back for their kayaks and paddles and raced toward the water. It was a sneaker, Katie yelled. We've got to get out of here. As she pulled on her helmet, Nancy stared at the azure blue sea, straining to see Jenna. She zipped the pocket flares into her wetsuit and tucked the parachute flares in the forward bulkhead as Katie had shown her. Then she put her kayak in the shallow water. Bracing herself with her paddle, she stepped into the boat. Sliding her feet forward to the foot braces, she lowered herself into the seat of the cockpit. Within minutes, she felt the tide lift her and carry her quickly away from shore. Nancy and the others paddled out about 50 yards looking for Jenna and calling her name. There were no rocks breaking the surface in this immediate area, but Nancy knew some were hidden under the water. If Jenna hit one of those rocks, Nancy thought, she could be unconscious. Or worse. We've got to reach her fast. She stroked her paddle through the water, watching for any sign. Finally, she saw something. It was Jenna's helmet breaking the surface of the wave. Then her head came up, and Nancy saw her lie back on the water's surface, gulping air. "There she is!" Nancy yelled to the others. She pointed with her paddle toward Jenna, bobbing in the surf as she skimmed over the waves about 10 yards away. The 4 rescuers paddled rapidly toward Jenna. Katie and George reached her first. Nancy struggled as she paddled against the current, but she and Ned had finally arrived. "How is she?" Nancy called out. "Is she all right?" "She's fine," Katie said, giving the thumbs-up sign. Nancy turned towards shore and gave Bess a wave with her paddle. She could hear Bess's cheer float across the water. "Thanks for coming out so quickly, everybody," Jenna said between coughs. She lay back on the surface, her life jacket keeping her afloat. "Are you sure you're okay?" Nancy asked. Jenna nodded and smiled. "Jenna's a real pro," Katie said. "This may have been her first time with a sneaker wave, but it sure isn't the first time she's been dumped in the surf." "Yeah, but usually my kayak is somewhere nearby," Jenna called back, spitting a mouthful of salt water over her shoulder. She pulled up a little on the bow of Katie's kayak, resting her elbows on the deck. "What's a sneaker wave anyway, and how come you didn't warn me about them?" "I'm sorry," Katie said. "I told the others, but I guess I forgot to tell you." "I've had quite a few surf spills in my career, but that was one of the worst," Jenna said, glowering at Katie. "And you're gonna pay for it, too," she said, "with the hardest workout you've ever had. To start with, you can pull me back to shore to get my kayak." Katie groaned in mock distress. Jenna floated around to the stern of Katie's kayak and grasped the grab loop firmly, her legs bobbing up behind her. "Okay, Firestone," she ordered. "Start paddling." When Katie and Jenna started for shore, George took over as the most experienced sea kayaker and instructor. "Let's go in a little closer to shore," she said to Nancy and Ned. "I want you to practice some moves, and I'd feel more comfortable if we were in shallower water." The 3 paddled in a little, then George stopped and turned to Nancy and Ned. It looked as if they were about the length of a football field out from the shore. "You've both kayaked," George said, "so I'm not going to go over paddle strokes. Just ask if you have questions." For the next half hour, George demonstrated how to read the waves and work with the currents. She also gave them a quick refresher course on how to recover from a roll or a capsize. They practiced both the sea-to-sea and lie-back methods of recovery. By the time George had finished their mini training session, Nancy could see that Bess was combing the beach once again. Jenna had gotten her kayak, and she and Katie were back out in the water. In fact, they were already at least 50 yards further out than Nancy, George, and Ned. Nancy could see by George's expression that she wanted to be out with Katie and Jenna getting in a real workout. "Go on out, George," Nancy said. "Ned and I will be okay." "Are you sure?" George asked. "We're not total amateurs, you know," Ned said, twirling his kayak around a couple of times. "Don't worry, we'll watch out for each other." "Great," George said with a grin. "I really want to get some serious training in, and it looks like that fog is starting to move already." With a wave of her paddle, George headed out toward Katie and Jenna. Nancy and Ned paddled around for a while. Working with the surf was very different from working with river currents. It was also very exciting and a lot of fun. Nancy and Ned challenged each other to a few maneuvers, and the time flew by. Nancy figured an hour had passed at least, and it must have been close to 4 o'clock. The sun was low, and the fog bank was floating very slowly across the sea toward them. She could barely see Katie, George, and Jenna bobbing in the orangey-blue waves. Nancy idled a while, enjoying floating with the tide. She watched Ned tilt and dunk and practice his rolls. Finally, he surfaced near her. "Hey, Nan," he called, "how about a race? I'll give you a 2-minute head start." "You're on," Nancy said, "and you'll be sorry you gave me any time at all." Nancy dug her paddle into the water and headed out on a line parallel to the shore. They were a little further out than they had been, but the sea was pretty calm. She looked back to try to see Bess, but Nancy and Ned had worked their way farther north. Large rock formations, which once seemed far away, were close now. The rock formations towered up out of the sea, blocking her view. She wasn't really able to see Bess's beach anymore. Suddenly, Nancy felt herself being pulled to the left by a strong current. She paddled against it for a while, but she felt the pull getting stronger as she got more tired. She looked around for a minute to signal Ned, but couldn't see him through the wispy fog that had begun to envelop the area. When she looked forward again, she realized she'd been pulled rapidly out in just that minute she'd taken to look for Ned. I know I'm being pulled farther out, she thought, because those rocks are getting closer. One of the rocks was huge, the size of a small building. When the light reflected at just the right angle off the water, she thought she saw a dark opening in the side of the rock. She looked back toward the shore and could barely make out Ned in the distance. He was paddling rapidly toward her, but seemed to be falling farther and farther back. He's not going backward, she mumbled as she realized what was happening. I'm moving forward and way too fast. The current really seemed to have a hold of her now. It was almost as if her kayak had a motor. Even the tide had no effect on it. She felt as if she had no control over her craft. Suddenly the kayak listed sharply to the left. Holding tightly to her paddle, Nancy followed Katie and George's instructions and rolled with the kayak. She used the sea-to-sea recovery maneuver, making her body into a C in one direction as she rolled underwater, then forming a C in the opposite direction to pull herself back up out of the water. In seconds, she was upright again. She blew out a mouthful of spicy salt water and gulped in air. It seemed to have become suddenly dark, so she lifted her goggles to get a better view. She stopped cold when she realized why it was dark. The sun and sky were completely blocked out by the enormous bulk of the huge rock tower. She was headed right toward the opening in the side. Her arms flailed against the waves, but her effort was useless. With one giant surge, Nancy and her kayak were flung through the opening into a dark sea cave. That's the end of chapter 9. Ridden is a meme. How so? Sea is in this book. The water too dangerous. Best just make I read that as sandwiches for a second. But making sandwiches on the beach also sounds fun. Sandcastles on the beach. Kayaks are like death burritos. Sometimes kinda. Death burritos? That's not as fun as blanket burritos. This is one of those shoulder songs. Okay. It's scurry. It is scurry. Okay, I think I'm going to do one more and then actually call it, so it'll be a really short stream, like an hour. Oh, thank you for shoulder dancing along with me. It's always nice to have a dance partner. Alright, I think I'm just going to do one more, and then I'll do the last chapters the next time we read this, which will be the last of the last third of the book. Okay. Chapter 10. Here's Looking at You. Nancy's heartbeat surged with the wave that carried her into the sea cave. Suddenly, her kayak slowed, and she drifted for a few minutes before hitting the inner wall of the cave. As the kayak floated, she felt her racing pulse slow, and she took a deep breath. She looked around as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. It was like being in a cave on land. Except the floor of the cave was the sea. The cave had been dug into the huge rock tower that rose up from the ocean floor and arched high over the water's surface. Over centuries, the sea had hollowed out the rock into a long, dark grotto. A few columns of light filtered down through holes in the high ceiling of the cave. Nancy's kayak was tangled in webs of kelp that had been swept into the cave with her. The water inside the cave was calm and dark, but was periodically flushed by a wave of foam. Nancy's kayak bumped against a ledge that protruded from the cave wall. She could see that in some places the ledge was underwater, and in some places it skimmed the surface. In front of her, the ledge formed a platform that jutted out several yards above the water's surface. Nancy placed her paddle on the ledge. Then she hoisted herself out of the cockpit and onto the ledge, pulling her kayak up next to her. She tried to stand up, but her legs were so wobbly she had to drop down to a crouch. Then she sat, pulling her knees up and leaning her back against the shiny, damp wall of the cave. Nancy rubbed her calves and knees. Then she leaned back again, took a deep breath, and rested for a few minutes. "Nancy?" Ned's familiar voice called out. "Nancy, are you in here? Where are you?" "I'm over here, Ned," Nancy called back. "See, I told you she'd be okay," George told Ned as they paddled toward Nancy's ledge. George, Nancy said, what are you doing here? The last time I saw you were way out there with Katie and Jenna. Yeah, well, it wasn't much fun, George replied. They have this real competitive thing going on. I mean, they're ferocious. There is no way I could keep up, so I thought I'd come back and whip you beginners. As I was paddling in, I saw that surge take you to the cave. Ned and I got here about the same time. This is really cool, Ned said, paddling in a circle so he could check out the cave. Let's do a little exploring, Nancy said. Do Katie and Jenna know where we are right now, George? They don't know anything right now but how much they want to beat each other. They couldn't care less where or how we are. She checked her sports watch. We've got at least another hour before they'll be ready to call it quits. Good, Nancy said. George and Ned held her kayak steady while she climbed back into her cockpit. Come on, she said as she settled into her seat and braced her legs. Let's take a look around. Nancy led the others toward what she thought was the back of the cave. The paddling was so much easier in the calm water. The farther back they went into the large space, the quieter it got. Soon even the roar of the surf was like a distant echo. Nancy was surprised to find there was more than one room of the cave. They wandered in and out of openings and archways for about half an hour. Occasionally they realized they'd gotten turned around and had backtracked into an area they already explored. Finally they came to a small room that was almost bright compared to some of the others they'd been in. A large hole at the top of the cave released a thick shaft of light into the center of the small room. Even a few wisps of fog drifted down around them. I have to pull over to a ledge for a minute, Ned said. I need to stretch my legs. I'm getting a cramp. Nancy and George followed him over to the wall of the small room. Ned got out of his kayak and did a few quadriceps stretches. What? The light was dimmer at the edge, but something still caught Nancy's eye. Something shiny glinted through the water from a section of the ledge that was just below the surface. She paddled over and reached under the water. The object seemed to shimmer as the water moved over it. She took hold of it, but it was jammed into a crack in the inner wall of the cave. Patiently, she tugged at the object, jiggling it until she finally pulled it free. Hey, look at this, she called to George and Ned. It was a silver belt buckle in the shape of a horse's head with a windswept mane. Very cool, George said. It looks almost new. I know, Nancy agreed. It can't have been in here for long. The salt hasn't affected it much yet. The only real marks are where it was wedged into the rock. I wonder how it got in here, Ned said. The same way I did, probably, Nancy said. It had no choice. She zipped the buckle into her wetsuit. Nancy and George held Ned's kayak as he climbed back into the cockpit. How are your legs? She asked him. Better, he said. The stretches really helped. Ready to do more exploring? Nancy asked Ned and George. Lead the way, George replied. As Nancy paddled away from the ledge, she heard an odd sound. It was almost like a whisper echoing around the walls of the cave. Do you hear that? She said, her voice hushed as she listened. What? I didn't hear anything, Ned said. He sounded a little impatient. You know what? I'm ready to get out of here. I feel like we've been going in circles. I'm ready for some daylight. Maybe we should hook back up with Katie and Jenna? Shh, Nancy said, idling her kayak. She closed her eyes, hoping that would help her concentrate on hearing. As she drifted, she heard the sound again. A low whisper floated through the fog. She couldn't make out any words exactly. It was more like a low, whooshing moan from behind her. The sound floated over her like the filmy fog. It was strange and eerie. A shiver cascaded down her spine as she looked around. There, she said, her eyes popping open again. Did you hear that? She looked eagerly at her friends. I hear a sort of distant roaring noise, George said. I'm sure it's the waves breaking in the distance. George said, Is that what you mean? She leaned her head out as if she were reaching for the sound. I'm not hearing anything but my stomach growling, Ned said. I'm getting out of this place. Go ahead if you want, Nancy said. I'm not leaving until I check out that noise. She pointed her kayak in the direction of the sound. She paddled through an arch to a dim circle of light in the far wall. I don't think we've been in here yet, George said. Well, that's a first, Ned answered. We've backtracked so much I thought we'd make a complete tour of this cave at least twice. I guess I was wrong, George said. It looks like we're back at the front of the cave. Or are we? George asked. That sure looks like an opening. It is, but I don't think it's the front, Nancy said. I think it's the back of the cave. Come on, let's go. She paddled off and reached the light within minutes. See? Nancy called back to the others. I knew it. It's like the back door of the cave. She paddled through the small opening just as the deep whisper sounded again, only this time it was louder, nearer. Nancy blinked for a minute when she emerged from inside the rock. They were completely enclosed in a thick fog bank, but it was still much brighter than it had been in the dim regions within the cave. There was a pale pinkish glow off to their left, and Nancy assumed that was the sun setting in the west, but she knew that meant the shore was to their right, but she couldn't see it through the fog. She looked around. They had drifted forward far enough that she could barely see the outline of the sea cave behind them. She'd never been in fog this thick and heavy. Suddenly, Nancy's kayak bumped into something hard. That eerie whisper curled toward her ears from the fog ahead of her. It was followed by a deep moan and then the whisper again. "Nancy?" George gasped, her voice low and a little shaky. "I hear that." "Me too," Ned whispered. The three idled against the unyielding barrier they had bumped against. Nancy felt transfixed, hypnotized by the unearthly sound. The soft whisper came closer and closer. Then something large and dark slowly broke the surface, and one huge eye stared at her. End of chapter 10. We are 2/3 done with the book, and that's where I'm going to finish for the night. Let me check up what's up going on. I should have a dance emote. I'm not opposed. Join circle and sits crisscross applesauce. Hi, Sarah. You're such a good reader. You have great enunciation. Thank you. Thank you very much. I try really good. It doesn't really get too foggy too often over here. Well, this is in California instead of Washington State. Yeah. I think. Yeah. San Francisco area in the book. Yeah, I try really good. That makes sense. I don't know if San Fran gets foggy. Does San Fran get foggy? Maybe. I don't know. They get really foggy? Okay, then that makes sense. Yeah, on the cover there it says, "On the rugged California coast, Nancy embarks on a deadly voyage." The closest I've ever been to San Fran was when we were at TwitchCon last year. And we didn't go into San Fran, so I don't know. So rugged! Alright, well, that's what I'm going to call it, guys. Very short stream. I've literally been live for exactly an hour and some seconds. Same. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. I will be on officially Hurricane Dorian duty as of tomorrow, so I will be going into work and not leaving work until Friday. I'm bringing my stream setup with me, and I'm going to try to stream the last third of this book as well as a few installments perhaps of Paper Mario. Those are the things I'm packing with me, so we'll see how that goes. Of course, it's all going to depend on what I'm needed to do at work, but until I see you guys again, please take care of yourselves. I will be safe, I promise. Thank you for being here. For anybody who popped in, even if it was for a short time, and anybody who's watching this later, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate all of you, and there's much love. So please take care of yourselves. I'll see you soon, and take care of yourselves. I'm saying that again. Good night. Bye.